Okay, for those who don't know, my name's Nathan Hughes and I'm one of the Centre co-directors, and on behalf of myself and Liam Foster, the other kind of Centre co-director, really pleased to welcome you to Circle's annual lecture for 2026. And before I introduce our sort of speaker for today, I just want to say a little bit about Circle. I was going to say, Sue, you have to send us a new picture because you must be fed up of seeing this one on slides. I think it's about the best that we've got. But for those who don't know, Circle stands for the Centre for International Research on Care, Labour and Equalities, and it was established, I think, back in 2006. Yeah, which means Circle is now 20 years old as of this year. It was established by Professor Sue Yendall, as on the screen now, of course, Sue Yendall OBE, who led the centre until she began her phased retirement back in 2023. And it's, again, fantastic to have you here today, Sue, to celebrate Circle once again. Originally based at the University of Leeds, before it followed Sue to Sheffield. For 2 decades then, it's been a base for conducting research, evaluation and consultancy on issues related to care, to labour and to equalities. And in that time, it's fair to say it's changed somewhat in terms of the scope and focus. And while we retain kind of strong interest in our work in labour, both domestic and paid employment, and of course in inequalities, as two of the things that are shaping care, the work of the centre really is focused in on the C and the centre of the circle, on issues related to care, caring and social care. And this has been reflected in Sue and colleagues' successes in targeting larger and more ambitious grants in this area, as evidenced first by Sustainable Care, which was an ESRC large grant exploring how adult social care provision can remain sustainable and amidst kind of socio-economic and policy changes. And more recently, the Circle has been both a collaborator in impact, which I'm going to say absolutely nothing about for fear of stealing any of Jon's lines, and in our leadership of the Centre for Care, first under Sue and now under Professor Kate Hamlin. The Centre for Care being what I like to describe as the ESRC's kind of flagship investment in social care research, including focus on social care workforce, care systems, digital care, unpaid care, and care right across the life course. But these large investments are just merely the most visible and the highest profile example of a sea of kind of care-related research which goes on within Circle and across the University of Sheffield. And shortly before Liam and I sort of took over our roles as co-directors of Circle, there was a review of research at the university that suggested over the 5 years previously there'd been some 110 care-related research projects, over £25 million worth of income behind it from a kind of wide array of different funders, and spread across all parts of our faculty in social sciences, but also across every faculty in the university. So an incredibly impressive body of work that clearly kind of puts us in the kind of upper echelons nationally and internationally in terms of kind of care and social care research. So in taking over from Sue then, the mission that Liam and I set ourselves was to draw this research together to try and create and build this kind of sense of community and collective around this care research. So as it says here, Circle aims to provide a stimulating and inclusive research environment for producing innovative, rigorous, evidence-informed and impactful research on aspects of care and caring across the life course. So we do this by kind of showcasing the work that's going on here. We do it by supporting and stimulating new projects, by embedding and investing in kind of meaningful engagement and co-production to build the mission, by building long-standing partnerships in South Yorkshire and beyond, and by using these partnerships to really try and emphasise kind of the impact that our work can bring. And this community is starting to take shape, and you know, thanks to those whose names are on this board, these are the themes that that started to emerge, that we're kind of coalescing our work around. I'm not going to talk through any of those, but spot the names, spot the themes, go to the website, which Dan has wonderfully curated for us, read about them. And in a moment, I'm going to put a QR code up, and you can scan that QR code and log your details. It's on the piece of paper. So you can log your details there, and we can get in touch and connect you with all of the wonderful people leading these themes. Or indeed, email us. Okay, so before I introduce our speaker today, just firstly, it's with regret that I need to let you know that unfortunately Sir Clinton Farquharson has sadly had to withdraw at the last minute today because of illness. And obviously we send our warmest wishes to Clinton. So today's event was designed to bring Jon and Clinton together in conversation about the role of evidence in bringing about change in adult social care. And in doing so, seeking to bring kind of different perspectives to that conversation. And Clinton, as Associate Director of Think Local, Act Personal, and through his wider work in kind of social care and disability rights as an expert in co-production, would have brought not only that lived experience of drawing on care and support, but also many years of leadership and advocacy around that change. And so his contribution is going to be greatly missed today. In his absence, Liam may try and reflect a little bit of what we think he would have offered today, but really I guess it's a request to you guys to try and fill that hole in the conversation for Jon when the discussion comes. And we'd really like to hear from you, your own experiences and your own thoughts and contributions, particularly from lived experience or advocacy or support for people in terms of the issues that Jon's going to describe. But that's not to detract at all from the contribution you're about to hear from our remaining speaker. So you won't need introduction to many of you, but I'll give it a go anyway. So Jon Glasby is Professor of Health and Social Care at the University of Birmingham and also Director of Impact, Improving Adult Care Together, to the UK Centre for Implementing Evidence in Adult Social Care. So he's a qualified social worker by background, and he's since had a distinguished career working across research, practice and policy advice. He's had a series of significant academic leadership roles, including as Director of Birmingham's renowned Health Services Management Centre and Head of School of Social Policy, and perhaps most impressively, my old boss. He's also advised major national policy processes, including as a special advisor to the House of Lords Adult Social Care Committee. So it's that combination of kind of social work experience, academic leadership, and a kind of deep engagement in policy and practice that makes Jon well placed to answer the question at the heart of the lecture today. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Jon Glasby to deliver this year's lecture, Making an Impact, How to Get Evidence Used in Practice in Adult Social Care.
Thanks ever so much, Nathan, for the invite and for that introduction. I'm nowhere near as good a speaker as Clinton, but I will do my best to try and to fulfil the brief. Now, when I trained as a social worker in Birmingham's inner city, I remember someone who went on to be very senior in adult social care say to me, "You'll make a good social worker, Jon. The trouble is you think too much." Now, I know what they meant. You can't ask too many questions at once. You have to ask questions in the way that the other person can hear. Sometimes you have to earn the right to ask questions. I'm sure I was a really irritating student. But the way it was framed, you think too much, was really interesting. There was something as fundamental as social care and social work, something that touches people's lives in such significant ways. In one sense, how could you ever possibly think too much? I also wonder whether it's something we would have said to a different kind of welfare professional. A trainee doctor might have been just as irritating, but we might have slapped them down in a slightly different way, with a slightly different kind of metaphor or way of framing the response. And to me, it speaks to research and practice, which ought to be two sides of the same coin, too often being separate worlds where different people do them. They don't have many shared spaces where they can come into contact with each other. And there's different notions of what constitutes kind of success that make it really difficult to span those two divides. Now, fast forward 25 plus years, and I'm now in an incredibly privileged position as Director of Impact, which, as Nathan said, stands for Improving Adult Care Together and is the UK Centre for Implementing Evidence in Adult Social Care. Run by a consortium of partners, including with Sue and Kate and colleagues here at Sheffield. And it was the result of a £15 million grant that was made available from two funders, an academic research council, the ESRC, the Economics and Social Research Council, and a charitable funder, the Health Foundation, who came together to make available this funding over nearly 7 years to identify a leadership team that would design and then deliver a UK centre for implementing evidence in adult social care. And Impact is an implementation centre, not a research centre. So it's about taking evidence that already exists and then getting it used in practice to make a difference to services and to people's lives, rather than a research centre that might try and generate new research, even if it then also works to try and implement that in practice. It works within and across each of the 4 nations of the UK, so it's very rooted in those 4 very different practice and policy contexts, as well as having the ability to share lessons across those boundaries between different nations. And although social care is a devolved policy issue, it's really kind of strange how little contact there is sometimes between different nations, and how few things there are sharing lessons across those boundaries. When Impact staff are in policy debates in each of the 4 nations, they're typically the only group that spans boundaries, and they're typically the only group sharing lessons from other nations so that we can all learn with and from each other. You would have thought that these would be 4 natural experiments, but it doesn't often prove that way. Now, crucially, and this is what Clinton would want to emphasise, when we talk about evidence of what works, we mean insights from different types of research, from the lived experience of people who draw on care and support or who are carers, and from the practice knowledge of people who work in different parts of adult social care. And we would see each of those 3 forms of expertise, research, lived experience and practice knowledge, as being valid ways of knowing the world in their own right, that you need to bring together to triangulate, and then just to kind of work with in practical terms as we bring people together from different backgrounds to work on hopefully common solutions to common problems. And I'll come back to that definition of evidence and how you actually work with it in practice a little bit later on. Now, the centre itself is led by a team that includes 14 different academic, policy and practice partners from across different nations, including people who draw on care and support and carers organisations, as well as organisations that represent different parts of the social care workforce. And we have 4 main things that we do, which I'll run through just to set the scene in a moment. Our impact demonstrators, facilitators, networks, and our Ask Impact team. And a number of those projects are about providing practical support in the realities of the workplace to help people draw down insights from evidence, to think of something different to do in response, to actually do it, and then to work out what is and isn't making a difference. It's a really practical, hands-on form of learning by doing and reflecting in the realities of the workplace and the realities of quite a difficult external policy and practice context. A lot of the individual projects are local, but if that's all they were, then they would be interesting things that happened for a period of time and that would then stop when the funding stopped. And one of the ways in which we try to be greater than the sum of our parts is through a function that we describe as national embedding, which is a slightly weird phrase, but works well for us and we're quite passionate about. It's about trying to scale innovation, not just by telling people about it, although we do that too, but by trying to get it embedded in how adult social care gets done in different parts of the UK, through our relationships with policymakers, regulators, professional bodies, and so on. And although this research is getting much more impactful over time, a lot of what I see is still effectively a form of dissemination. I've got something and the world would be better if you would let me give what I've got to you, and then if you would do something in response to what I've got. Now, we might have kind of jazzier and snappier and kind of more accessible ways of doing that, but it still feels quite a one-way, quite a passive form of dissemination, rather than a genuine process of co-design, or something that perhaps more proactively seeks to embed the innovation or the insight into the warp and weft of how adult social care, or whatever sector you're from, gets done. And for us, we describe that as a form of national embedding. Now, our 4 main delivery models, our demonstrators, our facilitators, our networks, and our Ask Impact team. For big strategic changes, we have a series of impact demonstrators, and they're 2 senior colleagues who are strategic improvement coaches work in a local system or a service for 12 months, leading quite a large, often quite a whole system, evidence-informed change. They bring leadership, coaching, change management, organisational development skills, and they're often working on quite big changes. One of our early demonstrators looked at how you manage waiting lists for adult social care across all the councils in the East Midlands of England, to give you an example. Another worked across the whole of Scotland, looking at the health and well-being of personal assistants. These are often quite large, quite complex, quite kind of multi-agency projects. Our impact facilitators then focus on smaller, often more bottom-up, maybe slightly more single organisation or more bounded evidence-informed changes. Again, working in a frontline organisation for 12 months. One of our facilitators looked at how you go about recruiting more men into care work, for example, challenging traditional assumptions about masculinity. They did that in a service provider on the edge of London that worked with young men with acquired brain injuries. And the project was about taking the evidence and helping that organisation to recruit and retain more men. And in one sense, it was that kind of focus within a particular service provider. Our national embedding team then started to work with other people, including organisations like the King's Trust and others, to try and share what we'd learnt about those issues with a much wider audience. And the University of Birmingham has its own school, which has a very strong kind of enrichment focus. And so we're able to run assemblies and a series of workshops for all the 11 and 12-year-olds around care careers and around encouraging young people, but particularly young boys, to think about care careers. One of the most terrifying events that Impact has ever run with 300 12-year-olds. Just brilliant, but terrifying in equal measure. So an example of a facilitator doing the work in the reality of a service, but then trying to kind of embed and to share and to make meaningful the learning. Our impact networks, led by Kate and Maria Teresa and based here at Sheffield, focus on complex but everyday practice issues. Many people in the audience will know about those. But they're made up of a series of groups all over the UK who are working on the same issue in their local area. Each group might be, 8 to 10 people, and they'd be made up of users, carers, practitioners, managers. They'd get some evidence-informed material from us to start them off, and then they'd go through a 6-month period of meeting and feeding back how well they shaped up to the evidence, what they're going to do in response, what happened when they started to do it, what barriers they faced, how they're going to get around them, what they're going to do next. And the team here would collate those insights from all the groups and then share them back out before the groups meet again for the second time, and then for the third time, and then for the fourth time. So the group itself is just doing its thing locally, making practical changes in response to the evidence. But the learning is scaling across the UK as the network progresses. And a number of those groups stay together for the longer term to act as a resource on behalf of their local system and carry on sharing insights and lessons with each other. And then finally, our Ask Impact team focuses on hot topics in adult social care, and it produces rigorous but really accessible and practical guides to the evidence. So one of our first guides was around recruiting and retaining staff in adult social care. It said, this is really difficult, nobody really knows how to do it, but the evidence suggests that there are 4 or 5 things that might help a bit. Here they are, and here are some examples, and that's the guide. And you've got to go through quite a kind of complex process to be rigorous and transparent, but to produce something that's so simple at the end of it, if that makes sense. So that's some of what we do, but I suspect what may be more of interest for today and for a broader audience and for the discussion and questions afterwards are some of what we're learning about evidence, about co-production and lived experience, and about implementation. And those were the things that I wanted to draw out more generally, using some of what we've done and learned from Impact as a kind of route into that. But hopefully, this is of interest in its own right, above and beyond the detail of what an individual centre might do. As I said earlier, our approach to evidence is based on a definition which is very inclusive. It includes research, it includes lived experience, and it includes practice knowledge. And when we were doing some really detailed national work to design and set Impact up, people told us that each of those forms of expertise was important in its own right, but they felt that some forms of research, often more economic and quantitative forms of research, were already seen as being quite powerful forms of evidence. So that if we were going to work with all those different types of expertise, we would have to turn up the volume, was the metaphor, on lived experience and on practice knowledge in particular, which are typically seen as less powerful than some forms of research. And in some academic disciplines, it's sometimes assumed that there's a best approach to carrying out research, that one form of research might be automatically better than another form of research. It gets described as hierarchies of evidence in some disciplines. And we don't believe that there is a best approach to doing research. It sounds really kind of simple and naive, but I've always thought it depends what you want to know as to what a good way is of finding it out. If you wanted to take a new drug, unless it was very experimental, you'd want to take a drug that had been researched and tested and developed in a particular kind of way. There are some methodologies that are really good at that, that produces incredible medication. You know, there aren't many circumstances in which you'd want to take a drug that hadn't been researched in that kind of way. If you wanted to know what it felt like to be sectioned and admitted to a mental health hospital against your will, you might go about trying to understand that in a different kind of way, maybe by talking to some people who'd experienced it, maybe by talking to some practitioners who'd done it, maybe by observing it happen. You know, there are other kind of ways of answering that kind of question because it's a different kind of question. And those approaches to hierarchies of evidence often assume that research is better if the person doing it is objective, in inverted commas, by which they mean more distant from the thing that is being researched. Equally, there are some insights from feminist research and from disability emancipatory research that say sometimes if you're really distant from the thing that you're researching, you increase the risk of misunderstanding it. And for some things, actually being close to the thing is really important. So there are these debates about being distant versus being kind of close up to the topic, as it were. Now that might sound really dry, like it's a kind of late afternoon, early evening lecture on the philosophy of knowledge. But really, it's about which voices get heard when we have these kinds of discussions, and indeed which voices get edited out of the process. It's actually a debate about power, not about philosophy or research. So our definition of evidence is a contribution in its own right. It really matters to us. But you then need to back it up with quite practical ways of kind of operationalising that definition so that you enable frontline practitioners and others to have access to insights that they can actually do something about. Lived experience is one of those forms of expertise. We tend to use the definition from the Social Care Institute for Excellence, SCI, that talk about co-production as people who draw on care and support and carers working with professionals in equal partnerships towards shared goals. My experience is that the term co-production gets used everywhere now to mean almost any form of relationship or kind of engagement. So it feels like it's increasingly losing its power and its kind of focus. But for me, there's an element of power sharing between the system and the people on the receiving end of the system. Otherwise, it's not really co-production. And I'm sure that's what Clinton would want to say as well. Sky have got this really helpful kind of jigsaw type approach that help you to think through your practice, but the kind of broader culture within which you're working, some of the structures that you're creating, and then a kind of emphasis on reviewing and learning and refining and improving. But to kind of to live out those values, we've then tried to build lived experience into everything that we do at Impact. So into our definition of evidence, into our leadership team and our governance, but also into our staff team. So in our staff surveys, over 50% of our staff, and there's probably 60, 70 of us at the moment across the country, over 50% of the staff say they have lived experience of adult social care, either as someone who draws on care and support or as someone who's an unpaid carer. And that could be anybody. It's from staff surveys that are anonymous. So it might be somebody who's delivering a project who you might expect might bring lived experience because they're really passionate about the project. But it could be the person managing our website or our finance or you know, any combination. But over 50% of staff bringing lived experience, and a similar proportion of people bring practice knowledge, including quite a large number of people who've worked as frontline care workers. And of course, a number of people will have all those different elements to their identity as well. And we all sort of have multiple identities, don't we, and bring different parts of that to our work in different kinds of ways. It's not exactly massively insightful, but we've learned that there's no magic answer to co-production and to building on lived experience. It's just about kind of creating the time, about building relationships, and about trying to kind of make progress together. I'm not sure you ever reach a destination, but it's about the kind of journey that you choose to take together. We've learned as well, you have to be really committed and skilled to do this kind of work, and you have to be really clear about and do whatever you can to try and call out and work around and challenge power imbalances. And to give you an example of that, some of our work is shaped by 5 impact assemblies. I chair one for about half of England with Clenton. Kate chairs one for the other half of England, and then we have other assemblies in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. And each of those is made up of about 20 or 30 people, with a mix of people who draw on care and support, unpaid carers, practitioners, managers, researchers, national bodies and so on. And those groups come together to share what Impact's doing with their networks and members, to support and to sort of sense check, but also to kind of challenge and shape the work as well. And we had to work and have to work really hard to make those very accessible, inclusive spaces, and to kind of work with the inevitable power imbalances that there are when you bring those groups of people together. So we think really carefully about how we recruit people and support them, about how we produce materials in accessible ways. If we introduce something in plenary, then all the actual discussion happens in small groups, so it's kind of less intimidating. There'd be a member of the Impact team in the room, not to kind of to dominate or to facilitate necessarily, but to make sure that everyone gets a chance to contribute and that individual voices aren't dominating. People will take part in whatever way kind of works for them. Some of our participants with lived experience either don't communicate verbally or find it quite difficult to process what they want to communicate on the spur of the moment. So they sometimes just listen to the discussion and don't actually contribute in the meeting at all, and then contact us afterwards to share what they wanted to say or what they want to say with the benefit of hindsight, so it can be built in. And in particular, we had one member of the assembly that I co-chair that just doesn't feel comfortable in group situations, contributing alongside people from other backgrounds, contributes afterwards. And then after 3 years, for the first time, we went into the breakout room, and she opened up the feedback and the discussion and contributed kind of live in the moment. And it was just one of those lovely moments where no one else would have noticed, but actually it was the product of 3 years, 4 years of kind of feeling more and more comfortable with the process, until she actually felt able to say in a small group setting. Now, that doesn't resolve any of the power imbalances that there are, or it doesn't solve anything, but it's just an example of trying to kind of work with the reality of those power imbalances. And then finally on this slide, we also find ourselves being a kind of critical friend to the social care system. Social care often prides itself on its attempt to be genuine about co-production and lived experience. Our experience of working across different parts of the UK is its actual track record in practice is really, really mixed and patchy. Again, this will be a blinding insight, but one of the key things about local government is it's local. And so it does vary very, very significantly from place to place. And we'll often go to a part of the country and there'll be some really established mechanisms and networks and relationships in one council, and go to one just a couple of miles down the road, starting from a very, very different place, very, very embryonic, and we were almost shocked, I think, by the degree of disparity. We sort of knew it intellectually, but until you see it up close, you don't necessarily realise it. And so in those situations, I think we've got a responsibility to help and to support, to model good practice, to link people up, Sometimes if it's not good enough and people aren't really aren't seeing it, to kind of call it out and to challenge it and so on. But a really important role as a kind of critical friend to the system. And I know that Circle and Centre for Care colleagues do that all the time in their work as well. And then we're an implementation centre, so the bulk of our learning is around implementing evidence in practice and how you actually do that for real. And when we were designing Impact, I remember Sue and I and others, kind of working together on this in the early years. People told us they'd got policy nationally and locally that told them what they ought to be doing. And they had growing amounts of research, Nathan drew attention to some of it earlier, growing amounts of research that was, kind of more or less helpful in giving you a sense of what might be fruitful. But the bit that was really hard, that everyone was struggling with, was, yes, but how do you actually do it for real, in the reality of frontline practice and the reality of a very difficult policy context? And how do you do it in the wrong part of Birmingham on a Friday afternoon when it's raining? That degree of granularity. Yes, I've got policy. Yes, I've got research. The bit I need help with is how to actually do it. That practical support in the reality of local services and of people's lives to try and deliver the policy, to act on the insights from the research. And a lot of people said adult social care has never had very much of that kind of practical support in its history. But in England, at least, what it did have often got lost during austerity. We had to make choices that prioritised frontline service delivery. And when we did that, the things that got lost were the training budgets and the improvement teams and the research and the evaluation activity and so on and so forth. And when there was a kind of bonfire of the quangos at a national level, it was always the ones that provided the kind of practical support that kind of got cold and so on. That practical support in the workplace seems to be, something that just makes a real difference to people. And in one of our nations, we've seen it with one of the regulators in particular that had a reputation at one stage for being, it was perceived as being quite punitive, that an inspector would come up, tell you that your service wasn't good enough, and tell you, well, I'm coming back in 3 months. If it hasn't improved, then there'll be quite significant consequences. And I might meet an owner of a care home or a nursing home who would say, I know it's not good enough, and I know it needs to be better, but I don't know what to do in response. If I had somebody alongside me that could help me work out how to improve and then help me do it, then I would do it, hand on heart. I really want to. I just don't know how, and I don't have the time and the headspace to work out what's kind of needed. It's that degree of practical support in the reality of very complex and very pressured services that seems to make all the difference. And then doing that work requires a completely different skill set to the skills that organisations like universities, say, have traditionally valued. Our impact demonstrators and facilitators aren't research fellows or senior research fellows or professors. They're people who bring organisational development, change management, leadership, coaching, consultancy type skills. It's just a completely different skill set. And if you're based at a university like I am and you're trying to create those kind of roles and recruit to them, you then have to kind of completely remodel the job descriptions that you have, the recruitment processes that you have. I know Kate's been in interviews all day today for one of our impact facilitators in Shropshire, I believe. It's just different to what more traditional research requires of people. I am based in an implementation centre, not a research centre, yet a lot of the systems that I work to were designed with research in mind. And so there's a constant kind of dialogue about how we kind of broaden our notion of what universities and their partners are about to make sure that we're sufficiently reflective and respectful of implementation and the skill set required. As I said earlier, we try and scale our approach and scale innovation through national embedding. And we've learned that you have to plan that from the beginning. You don't have a research phase and then an implementation phase, or a sort of local pilot phase and then a national embedding phase. These things are kind of two sides of the same coin that you have to plan from the very beginning and that run hand in hand throughout. Although we're big by adult social care standards, we cover the whole of the UK, so we're, it's a drop in the ocean compared to the level of need that there is. And with our embedding work in particular, we have to be really, really focused and strategic about what we can do at any given moment in time. And then equally, we've learned you've also got to be quite opportunistic and quite flexible. Sometimes stuff just happens, and that something that didn't look like it was ever going to be possible on Monday, looks like it might be possible on Tuesday. And you can't say, oh, that's really interesting, but we've got 3 strategic priorities and this isn't one of them, so we'll think about it next year. You've got to ditch one of the priorities or put it on the back burner and then go for the thing that suddenly opens up. So a kind of slightly unusual mix of being really strategic whilst also being really opportunistic and flexible at the same time. And they sound like they're contradictory, but I'm not sure they are necessarily. Sometimes it's just luck. You're in the right place at the right time. Sometimes I wonder whether you make your own luck a little bit as well. And one of our funders described it to us really in a really nice way when we were preparing for the last general election. And they said, oh, it sounds like what you're doing is making sure that you're on the call sheet of whoever is going to be making the subsequent decision. And thinking about all our respective work in terms of who's on the call sheet of people who are going to be making the decisions that you want to influence, and how do you get on the call sheet, and how do you stay on it, and are you on the right call sheets, and so on. It was just a kind of metaphor that worked for me really as a way of describing that kind of relationship. I work with a lot of academic colleagues that believe that evidence gives you an answer, and in my experience it typically doesn't. It either gives you more questions, or it gives you into a route into a process of dialogue and co-creation. I'm not sure it seldom gives you an answer. And I also meet a number of colleagues that believe that implementation is a one-off event, that something isn't implemented on Monday, you implement it on Tuesday, and then it is implemented on Wednesday. And I suspect we all know that it's more of an ongoing process than that, where you're doing this work and then you're kind of renegotiating it and re-exploring it and refining it and taking it further forward. It's a journey, not a destination that you necessarily reach. We've definitely learned that trying to implement evidence seems to work better when you can connect it to people's values and their kind of intrinsic motivations, the reasons that people came into the job in the first place, the kind of lives that people want to lead. One of our impact networks took some research that we'd done around people with learning disabilities or autistic people who were in long stay or secure hospital facilities. And the research was about trying to draw on lived experience and practice knowledge to find a way of helping more people come out of hospital and lead more ordinary lives. And there's still about 2,000 people in hospital at any given moment in England, very large numbers of them that have been in for 5 years or more, and so on and so forth. I've never met a social worker that trained to be a social worker in order to incarcerate people with learning disabilities in long-stay hospitals. It's just not what people came into the job to do. And so if there's a way of presenting and working with the evidence that would help people achieve what they were trying to achieve, then they'd be really up for it. And when we can do that, when we can connect people's values and their motives, then evidence becomes a kind of tool to achieve what you're trying to achieve, rather than the kind of extra thing that someone's telling you have to engage with on top of the 101 other things that you have to engage with. So I guess we try and make the case for evidence by showing people that evidence can help, rather than by constantly banging on about evidence, if that makes sense, although I do that too. And again, with that metaphor of being a critical friend, we often find ourselves having to be quite challenging in some of our practice conversations, in some of our policy conversations. But you do need to get the balance right as a critical friend. That works best when you're first and foremost recognised as a friend who likes the sector, who knows why it matters, who wants it to do well on people's behalf, and who is trying to help. And when people know you're bringing that kind of empathy, then you can really, often be very independent and potentially very critical when needed, because people know it's for the right reason and it's coming from the right kind of place. lots of colleagues in leadership roles and in practice have all kinds of people who are just being critical. And that's not often very helpful, but being a critical friend, I think probably is quite a helpful contribution, holding up a mirror to the system and to services. So you kind of earn the right to be critical through the relationships that you build and through people knowing that you understand the sector, that you empathise and that you're trying to help. There's all kinds of information online about impact, including the lots of the individual projects and the forthcoming projects that we started another 24 delivery projects, I think in September, for example. But one of the other things you'll see on the Impact website is a kind of framework that we've been developing to help people in practice in public service organisations, in private organisations, in community and user-led organisations, to help people lead or to carry out evidence-informed change. And the model takes people through a series of steps that you might want to follow if you were, I don't know, a team manager in a local authority and you'd been tasked with implementing a particular kind of change. And there's lots of material on the website that talks through the different steps, gives you practical examples, gives you tools and approaches that you could use. It's portrayed on the website as a kind of circle rather than a linear process, because our experience is that it's not linear, that people kind of typically get made responsible for or chucked in the middle of something, and almost irrespective of where you start, you still want to make sure that you've covered some of the different things that there are on the slide behind me. It's things like bringing the right people together to agree the issue that you're trying to solve or to kind of understand what success would look like, and making sure that that's co-produced, that that's based on lived experience. It's about mobilising the evidence in the ways that I've described, and a very diverse form of evidence, making sure you've got the right people involved to take that change forward. Then about taking kind of informed action in a really kind of meaningful and deliberate way. Co-production is central throughout that process, particularly in defining what success would look like and in understanding whether we're starting to try and achieve it. There's something about trying it out in practice and testing it in reality. And something really important that we often neglect about scaling and sharing and trying to sustain the change for the longer term. Completely by accident, when you spell that out, it spells impacts. It's amazing to think that that could have happened. And there's further information on the Impact website about that framework, if that's helpful for some of the changes that you're leading, some of the work that you're doing, some of the changes that are happening in universities and other kinds of organisations. It's just a framework to structure your thinking and to help you kind of reflect on and work stuff through. There's a community of practice that people can join, and we'll be piloting more of a formal development programme next year as well for colleagues in practice who want some more formal support about using it. The National Institute for Health and Care Research has also funded a very practice-focused PhD studentship to evaluate and to help refine the framework. And interestingly, a lot of the change models that are out there don't seem to have been designed with frontline practitioners or people who draw on services in mind, and also haven't been as evaluated as you would have thought they would have been from how prominent and well discussed some of those models are. When you start to dig under the surface, some of them are possibly slightly more paper thin than you would expect from how much you see them in the literature. So that may or may not be of interest to you. There's further information online, and I know people want to follow stuff up in questions and discussion, and there's lots that Clenton would want to draw out as well. I'll just go back to where I started though. Impact is this very large centre. We're very privileged to have the funding. The relationship with colleagues at Sheffield and with all the other members of the Impact leadership team has just been a privilege and a joy. With a centre that large, we have an internal evaluation framework and a series of kind of performance indicators and targets that we have to deliver. And our funders have also commissioned an external evaluation of our work, so there'll be loads of learning and material for us to share. So that's one definition of success. But going back to where I started, another definition. In the future, when a young, charismatic, maybe slightly irritating social work student says, well, why do we do it like that? Rather than saying, you think too much, and closing the conversation down, maybe a team manager, perhaps using that framework, will say, do you know what, John? Let's just say they're called John. Do you know what, John? We do it because there's really good evidence from the research, from people's lived experience and from our practice knowledge that that's a good way to do it. And that's why we do things like that around here. And for me, that's what success looks like. That's what Impact, what Circle, what the Centre for Care are about. It's practical support and the realities of the workplace, the reality of people's lives, to make a difference and to make a difference that sticks. Thank you very much.
That's brilliant. Really great to hear about impact capital letters and impact as well. So unfortunately, we're aware that Clinton couldn't be here. So when we found this out, we thought, well, what's the next best thing we can do? And we realised Clinton's on one of our podcasts. So an opportunity to advertise a Centre for Care Circle Impact podcast. Now, what was really good is we're thinking, okay, what shall we show? Because there's various really insightful and interesting clips. So we were listening to them, and Dan titled them, and the titles were, did we want Salt and Pepper or Vicar of Dibley? Which kind of reflects the approach to it. And I'm definitely going to choose Salt and Pepper now. We've only got time for one of his clips, and then we'll have some questions afterwards.
Have you come across that in your roles, that kind of assumption that when we, either a belittling of co-production as something that should run throughout everything that we do, but also when it comes to debates about evidence, that kind of assumption that evidence means particular types of research rather than lived experience, practice knowledge, and research. Clinton, would that be your experience?
I totally agree. One of the issues, even if when we talk about the term co-production, it's a bit jargonistic, and when I talk about co-production, it means working together, learning together, and also I hear a lot of organisations talk about they're doing co-production, and it feels, for me, it just reminds me of the song by Salt and Pepper, and they talked about let's talk about sex. And co-production for me it's like teenage sex. Everyone talks about it. Nobody's really knows how to do it. Everyone thinks everybody else is doing it, so everyone claims they're doing it, and that's how it feels for me. And I just think we need to actually do intentional relationship building to move in the direction that we need, because I believe we're at a crossroads, and resources, we need everybody to be involved in those discussions to look at creating something different and using new thinking to create that. And I believe we need to accept wisdom is that uncertainty is increasing, and the only way to look at is to bring people together to look to help become the solution. And one of those biggest solutions for me, I think, is it reminds me of a book by Ralph G. Nichols that talked. It's called "Are You Listening?" And the biggest quote that sticks in my mind about the book, it says, the most basic of all human needs is the need to understand and be understood. And the best way to understand people is to listen to them.
Very insightful thoughts by Clinton there. Thank you.